The outskirts of Blackwood, Pennsylvania were a mosaic of dying trees and gray fog. For the Miller family, the move from the sun-drenched coast of Perth to the shadows of the Sterling estate felt like a descent into another century. The house was a jagged mountain of Victorian architecture, its windows like cataract-clouded eyes watching the driveway, half hidden by overgrown ivy that looked like tangled veins creeping up the stone. My grandfather was a pioneer, David Miller said, though his voice lacked the pride it should have carried. He was staring at the heavy oak doors, clutching the brass key that felt unnaturally cold in his palm. Dr. Alistair Sterling. They called him the architect of flesh in the medical journals. He disappeared in the late 80s, leaving everything to me. This house is his greatest mystery. Elena shivered, pulling her coat tighter against the biting Pennsylvania wind. It smells like a hospital, David. Even out here on the porch, it's antiseptic, but with something else underneath. She was right. The air didn't carry the scent of pine or damp earth. It carried the sharp chemical sting of formaldehyde and something metallic, the unmistakable iron-heavy smell of a butcher shop at the end of a long, hot day. Inside the house was a museum of the macabre. The grand hallway was lined with anatomical drawings that looked too detailed to be sketches. They looked like flayed skins pinned to parchment, the muscle fibers and nerves rendered with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. 15-year-old Liam looked at a drawing of a human face, but the skin had been peeled back to reveal a second, smaller face stitched into the jawline. He felt a wave of nausea and quickly looked away. 8-year-old Mia, however, was not repulsed. She wandered toward the grand library, her small boots clicking on the marble floor like a ticking clock. She didn't look at the thousands of dusty medical journals. She looked at the shadows behind the shelves, her head tilted at an angle that looked slightly too sharp for a child. "There's a humming sound, Mommy," Mia whispered, pressing her ear against a section of the wall where the wallpaper was peeling like dead skin. "It sounds like a sewing machine." A very fast one. David laughed it off, chalking it up to old pipes and the imagination of a tired child. But that night, as a storm broke over the valley, the house began to speak. It wasn't the wind in the eaves or the rain on the glass. It was a rhythmic, wet thud squelch coming from deep beneath the floorboards, followed by a high-pitched, vibrating sound, the sound of a surgical drill. By midnight, the storm had knocked out the power. In the oppressive darkness, the family gathered in the library, the only light coming from David's heavy-duty flashlight. "I heard it again," Liam said, his voice trembling. "It's coming from behind the wall." Driven by a mixture of paternal protectiveness and a dark, inherited curiosity, David began to search the library. He pushed aside a life-sized anatomical model made of wax, a figure whose chest was hinged open to reveal organs that looked far too realistic. Behind it, he found a hidden seam in the oak paneling. There was no handle, no traditional keyhole, only a small golden slit, barely wider than a coin. David pulled a small, velvet-lined box from his pocket, a gift he had found in the lawyer's office along with the deed. Inside was a golden scalpel, its blade still impossibly sharp, shimmering in the flashlight's beam. As David slid the blade into the slit, the house let out a long, low groan, a sound of structural stress that felt like a sigh of relief. The wall didn't just slide open, it parted. The wood and plaster tore with a wet, ripping sound, the wallpaper stretching and snapping like cauterized skin. Beyond the door lay a staircase of black iron that descended into a darkness so thick it seemed to possess its own weight. A wave of stagnant air hit them, hot, humid, and reeking of rot and peppermint. "The bloodline returns," a voice drifted up from the abyss. It was soft, melodic, and sounded like it was being spoken through a throat filled with liquid. "Bring the girl, David. She has the hands of a creator. She has the stitcher's touch." At the top of the stairs, Mia's behavior changed. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were black voids, reflecting no light. Her small fingers began to move rhythmically in the air, miming the precise motion of a needle and thread. In and out, pull, knot. "Mia, stay back!" Elena cried, reaching for her daughter. But Mia stepped into the darkness with a grace that was no longer human. She moved toward the iron stairs, her voice joining the one below in a chilling unison. "Grandfather is waiting, Mommy. He says the masterpiece is unfinished. He says we have too many parts that are unnecessary. David, compelled by a force he couldn't name, followed his daughter into the hole in the wall. Liam and Elena had no choice but to follow, their flashlight beam cutting through the dark to reveal the first level of the basement. It wasn't a cellar, it was a laboratory. Glass jars the size of oil drums lined the walls, filled with a glowing, amber fluid. Inside the jars, things were floating. They weren't specimens, they were still moving. Liam pointed his light at the nearest jar and let out a strangled cry. Inside was a cluster of human hands, at least 20 of them, all stitched together at the wrists to form a grotesque, fleshy flower. The fingers were twitching in a synchronized rhythm, clawing at the glass. In another jar, a pair of lungs sat suspended, breathing the amber fluid, but the lungs were covered in human ears, as if the organ were trying to hear the air it couldn't reach. "My God," David whispered, the golden scalpel shaking in his hand. He didn't disappear, he stayed here. He was practicing. At the far end of the lab, Mia stood before a massive surgical table. On the table lay a figure covered in a gray, translucent sheet. The humming sound was louder here, coming from a machine that looked like a hybrid between a heart-lung bypass and a heavy-duty industrial sewing machine. "Mia, come away from there." Elena ran forward, but she stopped dead when the figure on the table moved. The sheet slid off, revealing the patient. It was a man, or what used to be a man. His torso had been elongated, 3 extra sets of ribs stitched into his frame. His arms had been replaced with long, multi-jointed limbs made from the legs of several different people. But the most horrific part was the face. The skin had been removed and replaced with a patchwork of different facial features. Eyes of different colors, a mouth that was too wide, and a forehead that had been stitched on upside down. The creature's eyes flickered open. It looked at David, then at the golden scalpel. "He wants the upgrade," the creature rasped, its voice coming from a speaker stitched into a. Mia reached out and took the golden scalpel from her father's unresisting hand. She turned to her brother Liam with a look of terrifying clinical focus. "Liam," she whispered, the golden blade catching the dim light. "You have such beautiful skin, it's so seamless. Grandfather says it would be a waste to leave it all on one person." The heavy iron door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, the sound echoing like a guillotine. The golden scalpel was no longer a key, it was an invitation, and the surgery was about to begin. The iron door's slam was final, a heavy, metallic sentence that left the family entombed in the sterile stench of the sub-basement. Liam backed away, his heels hitting the cold glass of the amber jars. The flesh flower of hands inside the tank seemed to react to his terror, their 20 fingers drumming a frantic, wet rhythm against the glass. "Mia, put the knife down." Liam's voice cracked, his puberty-strained vocal cords betraying his sheer panic. "This isn't you, it's the house, it's the smell. We can go back to Perth, we can go back to the sun." Mia didn't blink. She held the golden scalpel with a professional's grip, index finger along the spine of the blade, just as her great-grandfather had in the 1940s. She began to circle her brother, her movements fluid and devoid of a child's natural clumsiness. "The sun is for things that rot, Liam," Mia said. Her voice was flat, but it carried an echo of Dr. Alistair's gravelly authority. "Down here, we don't rot. We are preserved. We are improved." David stood frozen, his eyes glazed. The architect of flesh had not just left him a house, he had left a genetic beckoning. David looked at his own hands and for the first time didn't see fingers. He saw tools. He saw the potential for a more perfect design. "David, do something!" Elena screamed, lunging for Mia. But before she could reach the girl, the patient on the surgical table, the multi-jointed patchwork of a man, lunged with a speed that defied its distorted physics. Its elongated limbs snapped out like a spider's, pinning Elena against the brick wall. Its multicolored eyes rolled in their mismatched sockets, focusing on her with a predatory curiosity. "Specimen, female, prime, skin, elasticity, high," the creature's throat speaker crackled. A long, silver needle, threaded with what looked like human hair, slid out from a compartment in its forearm. "No, let her go," Liam yelled. He grabbed a heavy medical tray, swinging it at the creature's head. The metal connected with a sickening thud, but the creature didn't bleed red. It leaked a thick, yellow preservative that smelled like vanilla and death. It didn't flinch. Instead, it turned its upside-down forehead toward Liam. Its mouth, a jagged slit of black thread stretching into a silent scream. Mia used the distraction. She lunged. The golden scalpel whispered through the air. Liam felt a sudden icy sting across his forearm. He looked down, expecting a scratch, but the blade was so sharp he didn't feel the depth of the wound until the skin began to part. It didn't just bleed. The cut yawned open, revealing the white of his radius bone. "See?" Mia whispered, stepping closer to catch a drop of his blood on her fingertip. "The seam is so clean. You're built for this, Liam. You're a perfect canvas." "Mia, please." Liam fell back, his flashlight falling and rolling across the floor. The beam swept across the room, illuminating the living Weg, dolls, the other experiments Alistair had left behind. In the shadows of the laboratory's alcoves, things began to move. They weren't quite human, and they weren't quite dead. One creature had been stitched together from 3 different torsos, forming a tripod of weeping flesh that dragged itself across the floor with a rhythmic schlip-schlip sound. Another had no eyes, but its entire chest had been replaced with a large, pulsating lung made from the translucent skin of a dozen infants. They were the failures, the dolls that hadn't quite achieved the architect's vision, and they were hungry for fresh thread. "The masterpiece needs a foundation," the voice from the walls, the ghost of Alistair Sterling, boomed, vibrating the very marrow of their bones. "The boy provides the frame, the mother provides the shroud, and the father provides the hands." David finally moved. But he didn't move to save his son. He walked toward a cabinet labeled Sugical Silk, Grade A. He opened it, revealing spools of thread made from the dried optic nerves of his grandfather's victims. "David, what are you doing?" Elena sobbed, struggling against the creature's grip. "It's beautiful, Elena," David whispered, his voice devoid of emotion. He picked up a curved needle. "The symmetry, the potential. Why have 4 limbs when you can have 6? Why have 1 heart when you can have a backup?" Grandpa wasn't crazy. He was a visionary, and we are his final project. Liam scrambled toward the stairs, but the failures were closing in. The tripod creature blocked his path, its 3 mouths, stitched into its various necks, opening to reveal rows of blackened teeth. Mia stood over the rolling flashlight, her shadow stretching up the wall until it looked like a titan with a needle. She raised the golden scalpel. "Don't worry, Liam," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, ancient bass. "I'll start with the eyes. You won't need them to feel the thread." The sound of the industrial sewing machine suddenly sped up, a frantic whir-click-whir that drowned out Liam's screams as the first stitch was taken. The industrial sewing machine's rhythm became a frantic, mechanical heartbeat that pulsed through the very stones of the basement. Liam's scream was cut short, not by silence, but by the heavy, suffocating weight of a chemical-soaked rag Mia pressed over his face. The scent of ether and rotting lilies filled his lungs, turning his vision into a swirling vortex of gray and amber. As Liam's body went limp, David stepped forward. He didn't look like a father anymore. The man who had once carefully fixed Liam's broken toys was gone. In his place stood a man who saw his son as a collection of high-quality components. "The skin on the upper back is too tight," David murmured, his fingers tracing the line of Liam's spine with a terrifying, clinical gentleness. "It will pull against the new shoulder joints. We need to harvest more material." "David, please, he's your son!" Elena shrieked, her voice cracking as the spider-like patient tightened its grip. The creature's needle finger hovered just inches from her eye, the silver tip glistening with a drop of paralyzing neurotoxin. David didn't look up. He was busy threading the optic nerve silk through a curved bone needle. "He is an evolution, Elena, don't you see? We are removing the limitations of a single life. We are creating a family that can never be torn apart because we will be physically, biologically, one." Mia climbed onto the surgical table beside Liam's unconscious form. She began to hum the same tuneless Australian melody, but now it was punctuated by the sharp snip-snip of surgical scissors. With the golden scalpel, she made a precise circular cut around Liam's left shoulder. The blood didn't spray, it pooled, thick and dark, kept from clotting by the strange atmosphere of the lab. Mia worked with the speed of a machine. She wasn't just cutting, she was unzipping. "Grandfather says the dog was a good practice run," Mia whispered, glancing at a corner of the room where a heap of fur and flesh sat. Elena's eyes widened in horror. There, in the shadows, was Buster. But it wasn't a dog anymore. Its head had been stitched onto the body of a large predatory bird from Alistair's collection, and its legs had been replaced with human fingers. The thing let out a wet, whistling sound, the only noise it could make through a beak that had been sewn shut with copper wire. "Now," Mia said, looking at her father, "the secondary heart, from the jar." David walked to one of the amber tanks. He plunged his bare arm into the preservative fluid, his skin instantly turning a ghostly, translucent white. He pulled out a pulsating mass, a human heart that had been grafted with the valves of a pig and the veins of something much larger. It was still beating, a wet thud-thud that echoed the industrial machine. "Hold him open, Mia," David commanded. Mia used a pair of rusted rib spreaders. The sound of Liam's sternum cracking was like a dry branch snapping in winter. Elena felt her mind begin to fracture. The sight of her husband and daughter leaning over the open chest of her son, their hands slick with his blood, was a vision of hell that no human psyche could endure. "The tunnel," Elena whispered, her eyes rolling back. "The deep roots. I have to find the real Mia." As Elena's consciousness began to slip under the weight of the trauma, the basement walls seemed to melt. The rows of jars and the screaming machines faded into a thick, gray fog. She wasn't in the lab anymore. She was in the ethereal corridor of the Sterling estate, the place where the souls of the living dolls were kept in a state of permanent, agonizing transition. The floor beneath her was made of thousands of overlapping hands, all reaching upward, their palms stitched together to form a living carpet. Every step she took was met with a chorus of muffled groans. "Mia?" Elena called out, her voice echoing through the endless gray. "Mommy?" A small figure appeared in the distance. It was the real Mia, dressed in her favorite sundress, her hair golden and untangled. But she was standing in front of a massive, loom-like structure made of white bone. The loom was weaving a tapestry of human hair and skin, and Mia's hands were caught in the threads. Standing behind her was Dr. Alistair Sterling. He didn't have a face, only a mask of stitched-together eyelids. "She is the needle, Elena," Alistair's voice boomed, vibrating the very floor of hands. "And the boy is the thread. You cannot stop the great stitch. The family is being perfected." "I'm not letting you have them," Elena screamed, rushing forward. But in the physical world, the first stitch had already been pulled through Liam's flesh. David had begun the process of grafting the secondary heart into Liam's chest, the optic nerve thread glowing with a faint, malevolent blue light as it bonded the foreign meat to his son's soul. The masterpiece was no longer a dream, it was breathing, and its first breath smelled of formaldehyde and the end of the world. The transition between the worlds was a jagged tear in Elena's mind. In the ethereal corridor, she was screaming at the eyeless specter of Alistair Sterling. In the physical basement, her body was a limp vessel, pinned by the spider-like creature as her husband and daughter performed their unholy alchemy. "The tension is perfect," David whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, ecstatic fervor. He was no longer just sewing, he was sculpting. Liam's chest was a cavity of raw, red architecture. David had successfully nested the secondary multi-valved heart alongside Liam's natural one. The two organs didn't beat in unison, they fought each other, creating a chaotic, double-thumping rhythm that made Liam's entire torso vibrate on the steel table. "Now, the integration," Mia murmured. She reached into a basin of cold blue liquid and pulled out a length of spinal cord, taken from one of the failures in the tanks. With the golden scalpel, she made a series of deep, vertical incisions along Liam's original spine. She didn't remove his nerves, she braided them with the new ones. The optic nerve thread acted as a conduit, a glowing blue wire that fused the biological with the impossible. Liam's body suddenly arched, his eyes snapping open. But they weren't his eyes. They were flooded with the same amber fluid from the jars, his pupils turning into vertical slits. A sound escaped his throat, not a scream, but a mechanical, multitonal whistle that shattered several of the smaller glass beakers in the lab. "He's waking up to the new design," David said, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "He's feeling the extra capacity. He's feeling the architect." In the gray fog of the corridor, Elena lunged at the loom of bone. She didn't care about the eyeless Alistair, she only saw her daughter's terrified face. Mia, give me your hand. I can't, Mommy. The thread. It's part of me now. The real Mia was being pulled into the loom, her skin becoming the canvas for Alistair's eternal tapestry. The faceless doctor stepped forward, his hands, which had at least 7 fingers each, moving with a blurred surgical speed. You are a creature of division, Elena. Alistair's voice rasped, sounding like a serrated blade on bone. You want to keep things separate. Mother, father, son, daughter. But the universe demands unity. I am merely the tailor of the soul. You're a monster. Elena grabbed a shard of bone from the floor and drove it into the mass of threads. The loom let out a wet, human shriek. The floor of hands began to clench, pulling Elena down. She felt thousands of fingers grasping at her ankles, her knees, her waist. They weren't trying to kill her, they were trying to sew her into the floor. If you want her, you must join the pattern, Alistair whispered. You portsmurosnai course in a woman score. Back in the laboratory, the masterpiece was nearing completion. David had moved to the final stage, the redistribution of the skin. We need a shroud, David said, turning his gaze toward Elena's unconscious body. Liam's skin is stretched too thin over the new ribcage. He needs a maternal graft, the ultimate protection. Mia nodded, the golden scalpel reflecting the flickering overhead lights. The architect said the mother is the sheath for the sword. The spider creature dragged Elena toward the second table. David picked up a pair of heavy, bone-handled shears. The humming of the industrial sewing machine reached a deafening crescendo, the needles moving so fast they were a blur of silver light. Wait, a voice rasped. It wasn't David or Mia, it was Liam. The boy sat up on the table. His chest was still open, the twin hearts thundering behind a cage of reinforced silver-wired ribs. His new, multi-jointed arms, stitched from the failures, spasmed and then locked into place. He looked at his father with eyes that saw into different dimensions. The stitch is incomplete, Liam said, his voice a chorus of 3 different tones. He reached out an elongated patchwork arm and gripped David's throat. His strength was no longer that of a 15-year-old. It was the combined force of every body part that had been sacrificed to create him. Liam? Son? David gasped, his face turning a bruised purple. I am not Liam, the creature whispered. I am the legacy, and the legacy is hungry for the one who began it. In a blur of motion, the masterpiece lunged, not at Elena, but at David. The golden scalpel flew from Mia's hand as the creature she had helped create turned its clinical hunger toward its own father. The lab erupted into a symphony of wet tearing and mechanical shrieking. The failures in the tanks began to shatter their glass, sensing the shift in power. The architect's vision was finally coming to life, but it was a vision that devoured its own creators. The laboratory had become a slaughterhouse of unnatural geometry. David's eyes went wide, not with fear, but with a horrific religious awe as his son's new limbs, long, gray, and stitched from the remnants of a dozen strangers, wrapped around his torso like the legs of a gargantuan insect. The perfection, David choked out, even as the masterpiece that was once Liam began to disassemble his own father with clinical precision. Liam's fingers, elongated and tipped with surgical steel claws, didn't punch through David's skin. They unzipped it. Following the phantom lines of Alistair's unseen chalk, the creature began to peel the father's chest away, preparing to integrate the progenitor into the progeny. Mia stood paralyzed, the golden scalpel vibrating in her hand. The black voids of her eyes reflected the carnage, and for a flickering second, a tear of blood traced a path down her pale cheek. "Grandfather?" she whispered, her voice a fragile reed in the storm of mechanical shrieking, and formed a sound of gunshot. In the ethereal corridor, the shriek echoed like a thunderclap. The loom of bone shuddered, its threads of hair and nerve fiber snapping with the sound of gunshots. Elena, buried up to her chest in the living floor of hands, felt the grip loosen. The faces in the walls, the archived souls of Alistair's victims, began to scream in unison. The masterpiece in the physical world was a beacon, a black hole of suffering that was pulling the entire spiritual architecture of the Sterling estate into itself. "Mia, now!" Elena roared, using every ounce of her maternal will to tear her arms free from the floor of palms. She lunged at the bone loom, grabbing the real Mia's hand. As their skin touched, A jolt of pure, white-hot energy surged through them. It was the Stitcher's touch in reverse, a force of separation, of individuality, of the refusal to be part of a monstrous whole. Alistair's faceless specter let out a hollow, vibrating groan as his tapestry began to unravel. "You break the design. I'm taking my daughter home," Elena screamed. She didn't run for a door. She dove into the center of the unraveling loom, pulling Mia with her. The world of gray fog collapsed, folding in on itself like a dying star. Elena's eyes snapped open in the laboratory. The spider creature that had been pinning her was gone, its biological components having been recalled by the masterpiece to fuel its final transformation. She saw the horror on the table. David was no longer a man. He was a heap of raw architecture, his heart already being stitched into the cavity of Liam's widening chest. Mia was standing over them, her small hands guided by an invisible force, sewing her father into her brother with a frantic, blurring speed. "Mia, stop!" Elena tackled her daughter, knocking the golden scalpel across the floor. The moment the scalpel left Mia's hand, the girl's eyes cleared. The black ink drained away, leaving her blue Australian eyes wide, with a terror so profound it was silent. "Mommy," Mia whimpered, looking at her blood-soaked hands. I couldn't stop moving. The masterpiece, the thing that wore Liam's face like a mask on a mountain of meat, rose from the table. It stood 7 feet tall, its body a chaotic lattice of ribs, organs, and extra limbs. It turned its mismatched eyes toward Elena and Mia. It didn't move to kill them. It moved to absorb them. "One family," the creature whistled through its throat speaker. "One flesh! Run, Mia, the stairs!" Elena grabbed her daughter and lunged for the iron staircase. Behind them, the lab was disintegrating. The amber jars exploded one by one, releasing decades of failed experiments that crawled toward the masterpiece, like metal shavings to a magnet. The house itself was groaning, the wood and stone screaming as the entity in the basement tried to pull the entire structure into its biological mass. They reached the top of the stairs, Elena slamming the iron door shut and sliding the heavy bolt just as a dozen multi-jointed fingers began to wrap around the edges of the frame. Elena grabbed a canister of industrial cleaning fluid from the library and doused the door and the floorboards. She struck a match. "Goodbye, David," she whispered. The fire took hold instantly, fed by the ancient paper of the library and the chemicals seeping from below. As the flames climbed the Victorian walls, Elena and Mia ran into the cold Pennsylvania night. They stood on the edge of the driveway, watching as the Sterling estate became a pyre. The screaming from within the house wasn't human. It was the sound of 1,000 voices stitched together, a chorus of agony that finally faded into the roar of the fire. As the roof collapsed, a single glowing blue spark rose into the night's pulse of the optic nerve thread. Or epilogue. Weeks later, in a small motel room in California, Elena sat watching Mia sleep. They were heading back to Australia, leaving the legacy of the flesh stitcher in the ashes of Blackwood. Mia shifted in her sleep, her small hand hanging off the edge of the bed. Elena walked over to tuck her in, but she stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. On Mia's inner wrist, beneath the skin, something was moving. It was a thin blue line, a thread that wasn't made of blood. Elena watched in frozen horror as the thread began to move of its own accord, stitching a small, perfect circle into Mia's skin. A voice, soft as a needle through silk, drifted through the quiet room. "The work is never finished." Elena looked at her own hands. A small, golden glint caught the light. Her fingernails were turning the color of polished brass. The architect hadn't died in the fire. He had simply changed his needle.